we'll post this. And I remember to hit record, so I'll do that too. I'll put up the PDF of these slides tomorrow up on our website, and you'll be able to get them from there. So buds and bark, and off we go. Buds are fantastic, and I absolutely adore them. They are very interesting and very unique. So buds are visible on most twigs. They're indicative of the resting stage brought on by climatic conditions. And remember, climate is different in different places. So if you happen to go to, say, Africa, they're going to have a resting stage for their plants during what is the hottest time of the year because they don't have enough water. So remember that the resting stage for a plant could be different depending on where you are. Obviously, in this area, the resting stage is going to be in winter because it's an unfavorable time for growth. It's too cold, and we don't want any freezing to happen in our trees. And our buds are often covered with scales. And you can see on this Amelanchier, we have at least 3 or 4 scales that are visible right here. That's very pretty. I'm often really surprised at how colorful buds are. And you'll hopefully agree by the end of this talk. Buds are the embryonic branches with miniature leaves and flowers. If a bud does not have scales, the bud is considered naked. And if you can see, if it is a naked bud, you can often see the first set of leaves that are curled and usually trying to clasp one another. So I've tried to draw in where the edge of this compound leaf is on this bitternut hickory. So you can see where the leaf edge is that's folded over the other leaf to try to make sure that they don't dry out and that they don't freeze and that they make it through the winter together. And this is a bitternut hickory. As we've just talked about, it has a naked bud, and you can see the 2 leaves just nested together. I didn't know this until this presentation, but some buds are not visible at all on trees, and they are embedded within the twig, and they don't emerge until we get to spring. And of course, I didn't believe the books and went stumbling outside. And of course, the first thing I ran into was a black locust. And in between those spines, you can see that there is no bud. All that is left there is remnants of the leaf scar from last year's leaf that fell out. And that bud would be right in here if it was present, but it is embedded in the twig and it will push out at the beginning of spring. So I should make sure we all know where buds are on trees. I decided to not go through all the characteristics and the parts of trees because we've done that several times in the past during this presentation. So I wanted to just make sure we were all clear on where buds are. They should be at the end of branches, and we should see terminal buds on the end and then lateral buds on the sides. And other things that are important when you are looking at a twig is you can come across these leaf scars. So this is what happened. So last year's leaf has fallen off the tree, and this is the mark that's left for where that abscission zone was created to prevent just water pouring out once that leaf fell off. And inside those leaf scars, there could be bundle traces or vascular bundle scars. They have different names depending on which books you're using. Other things we want to look at while we're looking at twigs is whether or not we have dots on our twigs. That could be lenticels, and luckily this hickory twig that I put in here does have some lenticel dots on it, so that's helpful. There can also be hairs on these twigs, and that could be very key and diagnostic as you're trying to figure out what you've got. Some twigs you might want to cut in half to look and see what the pith looks like. I didn't go into pith today because I try not to be too invasive when I do my tree ID. But if I am really stuck, I will get out my penknife and take a closer look to see what I've got going on. And I think that's everything that we needed to talk about on this slide. Yes, they could be lateral or axillary, those lateral buds. I didn't say that. Our buds are very tricky. We have some buds that look like they're terminal buds, but they're actually not terminal at all. They are pseudo-terminal buds. And this is a river birch here. And you can see here's the bud that's at the end of the branch, and we have a little piece of wood that goes past it. And then this is a piece that has died back from last year's growth. So when this opens up next spring, it's going to go in that direction. Whoops, I didn't want to change my slide. Because this right here is a hard stop. So if you are a piece of wood and you're a bud, you can't go through the wood. You have to go in the opposite direction. So we have several different trees in our area that are going to have a light zigzag pattern to the branches because of these pseudo-terminal buds that are pushing our branches from going one direction and another. And I have an example of that in the slide presentation, so I hope I can show that to you as well. And this American basswood right here, this is also still an axillary bud or a pseudo-terminal bud or a lateral bud that's sort of trying to assume the position of terminal. But you can see that there's some wood past that on the side over here. So when this bud comes out, it's going to grow in this direction. And then as you can see down here, the bud prevents it. The wood has to go in one direction and the bud goes in another. And that's the American basswood. Beautiful color this time of year if you get up to them and take a look at them. One last thing about these pseudo-terminal buds. In these two examples, it was really easy to see. And sometimes when you're looking at buds, it can be often difficult to see whether or not it is a terminal bud or a pseudo-terminal bud. So I wouldn't get hung up on that, but I just wanted to let you know that that happens and that can cause some changes in growth, and that can be diagnostic later on. Bud types. There's lots of bud types out there. We can have bud types that are flowers, and we can have bud types that are for leaves, and then we can have bud types that are a mixture of flowers and leaves. So here I have a dogwood, a flowering dogwood, and you can see we have this onion-shaped flower bud over here. And then down here on the side, we have this valvate leaf bud over here. And that has a valvate. It's got two sides that come together. And when those peel back, we'll have the new leaves come right out of that. So our flower buds are usually larger and fewer, and our leaf buds are usually more and smaller. If we could make that any more interesting to say. And I couldn't help myself. Here is the pawpaw. It has a pair of leaves nestled together. It's got a naked, it's naked bud, so it has two leaves that are folded together at the top. And then down here, you can see we have the flower buds. This one's sticking up on that side, and this one's on this side. I think they look like little brown pom-poms that are sitting on the side of the pawpaw tree. And those will obviously open up in spring and have that nice maroon flower that hangs down when they open. Love that tree. And then I decided I should put in one more because I really like this. I hadn't ever even looked for the leaves on a spice bush, but here's our spice bush, and we often see these really big flower buds sitting out all winter long that are super obvious and help you identify this tree. And if you're not sure you have it, you can always do a scratch and sniff because this will smell pretty good if you do that. But in between these little flower buds are tiny leaf buds, and that's where all the leaves are going to come out of. And Usually our forest floor becomes covered with yellow flowers. I think it goes elm, maple, uh, alders, and hazelnuts. And then we start seeing the blanketing of the spice bush underneath the forest floor of a nice yellowish color. And if you haven't looked for it before, now that I've mentioned it, I'm sure that you'll see it this year. It's very pretty. And they can be dioecious. So there can be male flowers on one tree and female flowers on another. And the female will obviously have the fruit. And it can also have male and female on the same plant. So it's one of those very fluid sexuality wise trees. And then I think the last one I have here is the American beech, and this has the mixed bud, which has both leaves and flowers that are going to come out of these buds. These are really long, about an inch long, these buds. They're covered in these beautiful scales that sort of are imbricate, which means they overlap one another like the shingles on the top of your roof of your home, and they can be really pretty throughout the winter months. I decided I wanted to try and give you guys as many things to take out with you in the field as you can. So here I have just a slide of green twigs. So when you are out in the woods and you find a twig that is green, we have two different things that it could be. And if it has opposite branching, like this over here, it's going to be box elder, and you should be somewhere near water if you are seeing a box elder twig. And I put this second insert in here because the leaf scars that are below these buds actually come all the way up and touch one another on each side of the twig. So you'll have these two touching leaf scars and buds sitting in each of them on either side. And you can see the piece coming up on this side, and then the bud is here, and then you've got the terminal buds right up here. So if you're near water and you see these big, or actually these green twigs, you know that you have a box elder. Sometimes they can be a little, I've seen them be a little bit brownish, but bright green is what we want to see. The other thing that you might see with green twigs is sassafras, and sassafras is alternate branching. So there's one over here, and then there's nothing on the opposite side of it. So you have to go down and then you find another piece. So this is going to be the sassafras that has the green twigs through winter. And if you're on a trail that's used quite a bit anywhere, really, usually there's small green twigs along those trails that'll be about 5 to 5 feet or taller. And if they're green like this and they're alternate branching, then it's going to be a sassafras. And if you're not sure, you can scratch it, and it should have a lemony pledge smell to it, because that's where saffrole is. And those are our green twigs that we should see in the woods. We have two of them. If you get anything really small, we do have some small blueberries that are going to have some green twigs, but like you're at like 1.5 feet off the ground. So you're not looking at trees at that point. You're looking at very low shrubs, and we're not doing that tonight. So we'll keep going. And then I decided we should do some red twigs and buds, because we have a lot of red twigs and buds. And these are our opposite branching red twigs and buds. The first one is going to be the red maple. And I really love red maple buds. They absolutely are fantastic. And you can see from here, they have white outlines around the edges of their scales. There's little tiny white hairs outlining each of the scales around the red maple bud. And they almost look like white mascara, white eyelashes that are surrounding each of the scales on it. And you can see again here, the silver maple has it a little bit as well. The silver maple will always have more buds many more buds, flower and leaf buds on the ends of their twigs, whereas the red maple usually has them in ones or twos, so there's not as many when you're looking at these. And then up here in the mountains, we also have a striped maple that has a fairly pink twig and is also opposite branching. So we've seen our box elder that has green twigs, and then we've seen all of these red twigs and buds, and these have all been in the maple family. So the maples are really trying to make it easy for you when they go out in the woods. They want you to see some color so that you are able to identify them out there. There's one more opposite that I keep running into, and it's kind of a new one for me. It's a silky dogwood. So I thought I should throw it on here. I see it a lot being planted everywhere, which is why I thought I should toss it on here because if you go outside and you start looking for red twigs and you find one right in your yard and it is not a maple, I don't want you to be upset with me. So this will be a dogwood when it opens, and the buds on this are going to be small and gray in color. You're not going to have these beautiful red buds on the ends. The buds on these are usually not very red. And of course, I can't be outdone. We just did opposites, so now we have some alternate branching trees that also have red twigs. We showed the American basswood earlier. Here it is again. I think they look like, do you remember the dots you used to get as a kid? They're they're a little gummy thing, and they're kind of in the yellow box that you shake. Anyway, I think they look like these dots just stuck to the tree, and they always sort of are off kilter. They're not sitting the same way in every branch as you look at a twig for an American basswood. They always seem to be just a little bit jauntily in place. Then the other one that I see that has the red twig is going to be this sourwood. And the sourwood is not a very frequently seen tree unless you happen to be at Walnut Creek. There's lots of them there. And they have a very obvious bundle scar inside the leaf scar, which is U-shaped. My picture didn't do a great job of showing that, but I was more excited that I had a red twig with red buds. So that's where I was going when I took my picture. So those are red twigs and buds. So this is a buds and bark talk, so I should start talking about bark. We've been looking at buds for a little while, and it's definitely time to switch over to the other side of the equation. So what does bark do for trees? It is going to help prevent water loss. It's going to protect the tree from extreme temperatures and intense sunlight. And bark can also be somewhat porous because it has lenticel lines that help trees breathe. And as we all know, if we have taken the tree steward class, our trees can't heal themselves, they seal. So when there is something that happens to the bark, it slowly has to grow over and cover that because it can't fix that the way that we can when we have a cut on our hand. So I'm going to get a little bit into the weeds here, but I know all of you are going to be just fine on this. Here's a cross section of a tree trunk, and our woody plants have two cambium layers for secondary growth. These are lateral meristems. So at the top of our branch, we have a apical meristem, or actually at the ends of all of our branches and the very top of our tree has an apical meristem. But our tree trunk has two lateral meristems that are helping it get girth. One is the vascular cambium that's inside, and right here, that is labeled right here is this blue, and it goes all the way around. And the green on the outside of that is going to be the phloem, and then on the inside is going to be the xylem. And that's the xylem is going to be what we consider to be the wood that's building up on our tree. And then there's a secondary cambium called the cork cambium. And this is a cambium that is outside of the phloem, and it's creating cells that go inside, and it's also creating cork that goes outside. And the whole thing together is called the periderm. And I will try not to use too many different words here because it can be a little bit annoying because every slide has a different section, different way of labeling this stuff. But this cork cambium is going to be what is creating our bark. And that's why it's really important for us to recognize and understand that we have a vascular cambium that's growing laterally, and then we have a cork cambium that's growing laterally to help our tree gain the girth and size that it's supposed to. And this periderm layer, which is going to be, it's made up of 3 layers. One is called the cork skin, then it's the cork cambium, and then it's the cork. And all 3 of those together are protecting our tree from the vascular cambium, everything inside that, from any environmental elements like heat, cold, and desiccation. And our cork also prevents any fungal or bacteria infection. So we want to make sure that nothing is getting into our plant to hurt it. And we all know that the very outside, these cells are dead, but they retain their qualities to be able to be protective, and they still provide insulation. So it's important that they're there. And thanks for bearing with me because that's a lot. But the main thing I want you to get is that we have a vascular cambium that's growing, and then we have a cork cambium that's growing. And our bark all depends on how things are growing and whether they're growing in sync. So as that wood thickens, which I call the xylem, as that gets bigger and bigger, there's increased pressure on that secondary xylem, the cork cambium, as the xylem gets bigger and bigger inside the vascular cambium, then you have the cork cambium that has to either grow at the same rate as that, or it starts to have a problem and there's increased pressure and things start to break. So here, the American beech, its periderm, which is that cork layer, that 3-layer piece for cork, expands at the same rate as the vascular cambium. And that periderm has to go 3 inches inside, gain 3 inches in girth for every 1 inch of wood that's put on the tree beneath it. So it's that cork cambium has to like do double duty, or actually triple duty, to keep up with what's going on inside the tree itself. And where there is a problem and the cork cambium can't keep up with the vascular cambium, that's when we start seeing breaks and cracks and fissures in our bark. So our red maple, for when it's younger, is able to keep up. Those cambiums grow in unison, but as the red maple gets larger, the cork cambium starts to break down and it isn't able to keep up. And that's what's going to give us different types of bark on the outside. The other thing I should mention while we're here is this is where the size of the tree that you're identifying is important. I often say when I start a presentation on tree ID, like, please do not try and identify anything that's under like 3 inches at your chest height, because otherwise it's too small to have any bark characteristics. And without bark characteristics, you only can identify by bud. And that makes your life really hard. I don't want you to do that. I want you to be successful if you go out and do tree ID. And by choosing a really small tree, you've made your job a lot harder. And even I will skip the little twigs because I don't want to have to worry too much about that, especially when I'm doing tree ID for somebody. Um, so every individual species of tree might have more than one bark type that it has, depending on their given age of growth. So as we just looked at on the American beech, or actually in the red maple, when it's really young, it has smooth bark, but as it gets older, that bark changes and starts getting furrows and fissures and fractures in it. So it changes. There's also a chance that a bark can have two different types of bark characteristics, and we'll look at those later on. And the last thing that you have to remember is that two similar sized trees of the same species can have markedly different bark types. I know that doesn't sound fair. But remember, we have to be considering the tree's age. That's a better predictor of the bark characteristics than the size. So if I am a beech, no, I'm sorry, if I'm a red maple and I'm growing in a bottomland area and there's lots of water, I'm sheltered from the wind and cold and everything, I get a lot of wood growth every year, all the time. But I might only be 10 years old. Whereas around the corner, on a windy uh, ledge where it's dry and hot, um, this same aged red maple might only be 3-inch DBH because the conditions are so harsh and hard that it's not putting on a lot of wood every year. So we have to remember where we are and what our tree is subjected to um, as we think about how we look at bark. And that might just be another annoyance, but we should just keep it in the back of our mind. So as the layers, so that we talked about that inner vascular cambium continuing to grow, and then we talked about that cork cambium, and as it can't keep up, it starts to break up. And as that thing starts to break, there's a need to continue to make bark. DBH stands for diameter breast height. Sorry, so I tried to avoid saying it earlier, but then I snuck it in there by mistake. And that's why I said if you're picking a tree out and you use your chest to measure what size tree, make sure it's about 3 inches, because that's about diameter at breast height, somewhere there. So back to this. So as the bark cambium breaks, and there's an importance to continue to have an active bark cambium inside the tree. So an active one is recreated inside the phloem. That means that sometimes there's phloem and cork that gets stuck on the outside of the bark of the tree. And when we're looking at some of these, we can see alternating layers of old periderm and phloem that create these layerings that happen on the outside of this tree. So this is a common hackberry, and you can count how many years worth or how many layers worth of periderm have been pushed out on this bark. And I think that's really cool. And there's a name for this protective layer of when you have phloem and old periderm stuck outside, and it's rhytodom, which is from the Greek and it means wrinkled, which I'm like, I don't think this looks wrinkled. I think this looks gorgeous. But that just might be my own subjective viewpoints. The other picture here is I've listed it as slippery elm. It probably should be just listed as an elm species because I'm not sure exactly which one. But this is another tree where you can see these different layers being sloughed up on the outside if you look at it side on to the actual trunk. And I think it's fascinating to see these because this is old material that's being pushed out on the tree, and sometimes they don't fall off and other times they do. And we can see the rhytoderm layers of the dead periderm or dead cambium and phloem all over both of these, which is really neat. Then we have lenticels. Lenticels are elevated regions within the cork cambium, and they want to create intercellular space to allow gas exchange and water exchange. So what happens is that cambium divides rapidly, much faster, so that it breaks through, allowing for air to come in and out of the tree. And that's where we get these little lenticel lines that are showing up on these trees. And lenticels can occur in a variety of shapes and sizes. Most of the ones I'm showing you are linear, but there's diamond shaped, oval shaped, round, and they're often a different color than the surrounding wood, which this one gives a good example of. And they're also easier to see when your tree has smooth bark. If your tree has peeling bark or breaking bark, it's hard to see these things. And just because I am such a nerd or a nerdy girl, this is a lenticel on the outside of a bark of a tree. So we have the cambium, the cork cambium in here, and you can see it's making cells at a much faster rate than over here, and that's to open it up and allow for the gas and water exchange coming in and out of the tree. And I think that's really cool. Oh, and I wanted to give you some examples of other trees that have different lenticels. Spicebush has little round dots. They're like white little dots all over the spicebush. And then big tooth aspen usually has diamond shaped lenticels. So peeling horizontal and curly strips. The visible surface of the tree that peels horizontally and curls into these is the cork layer that's peeling back. The stress of the wood expansion underneath causes these thinner outer layers to peel back. And it's usually only a few cells thick, and they peel away from the trunk. And this peeling will actually help the tree keep a consistent bark thickness, which I never thought they had to worry about, but I guess they do. This is a yellow birch. So if you came up into the Blue Ridge Mountains, you would see this near waterways. There's some water right behind it. And it has these curly peels on it. And you can still see the lenticel lines on here. So earlier on, I talked about sometimes our trees can have multiple types, bark characteristic types. Well, this is a tree that has lenticel lines and curling, peeling horizontal bark. So it has two in one on this one. And the next one over here is river birch. River birch, also you can still see some lenticel lines on this. I hope you can see those. And you can see it has that pretty pink salmony color underneath. I think of this as almost like a watercolor bark for a birch tree. If you find a twig for a yellow birch, it's going to have that nice wintergreen smell. If you do a scratch and sniff, your river birch is not going to have any smells that are worth noting. I wouldn't even bother. I'm going to take a sip of tea. So here we have vertical cracks or seams. I have to thank my husband. He let me drive him or make me drive. I asked him to drive me all over the county today because I needed to find some good vertical cracks and seams. These are hickories, and you can see these are just starting to crack. So this is the periderm, or that cork layer is initially stressed, but it's not yet splitting. And here it started to split, and they often start at a weakness on the outer bark of the tree, which is typically where a lenticel is. And because that's the weakest part of the cork cambium area or the cork. And inside this hickory, you can see this orangey color that comes up as that cork cambium is unable to keep up with the vascular cambium underneath. And I love how cool the bark on hickories is. You can also have plates and scales. So this is where I call it the rhizodome, that thickness of those layers that are stuck, the phloem and cork that are stuck on the outside of the tree that are dead. What happens to those is they break into different layers, and how they break depends on what type of bark you get. So for the American sycamore, this plated bark forms when groups of overlapping sections of that broken cambium, cork cambium underneath, are held together by fibrous tissues underneath. And they can be variable shapes and sizes. And the larger plates usually are stiffer and than scales, but this is a sycamore, and this is the only one that has very pliable plates that can flake off onto the ground. The bark with scales here is the black cherry, and these rhizodome layers break apart along borders that are overlapping in sections, and these scales are usually around the same size and shape all over the tree. And I haven't really, I think of these as burnt potato chips on black cherry, and I never really looked at if they were all of a similar size and shape. So I was kind of surprised when I stepped back and I did see that. You can still see some little lenticel lines on some of these pieces of bark, but that is how the black cherry is creating that platy look or scaly look of its own. Vertical strips are happening on silver maples. Another one that has this is going to be the shagbark hickory. So these strips are usually 3 times longer than they are wide. And in this instance, that cork layer has formed in long vertical oriented sections. And there's fibrous tissues that are banding those pieces together. And that's what gives these pieces the very shaggy appearance from the top. And I think that silver maple is so cool because they're usually in like 2-foot long segments. And I thought it was really interesting to read today that like these are usually, start at least 12 inches or at least 12 inches long, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh, that makes sense because I usually see them like 2-foot sections on a silver maple when I see a silver maple. So maybe that's just me. Ridges and furrows. So we've heard that all these different ways of how the cork breaks up. And for these trees, there's a fibrous layer of tissue underneath that's going vertically and then horizontally around the tree. Right? Did I do that right? Vertically? Yes, I did. So these bands of fiber cells keep things in place and keep them adhered together, and then they build in thickness. So when you have intersecting ridges, this trunk has this fibrous tissue that runs around the circumference that prevents these ridges from separating completely. And then and that's the tulip tree. And in this one here, these ridges end up being broken horizontally, and that's because the fibrous tissues that going vertically on the tree start breaking, and they're because of that they start falling apart and having these lines that break them up. So that fibrous tissue is not as continuous as it goes around, up and down and around. And then uninterrupted ridges are usually 12 inches or longer, and they don't have the fibrous tissue that goes around is weak, which causes them to not have, they have these long furrows and ridges, and that we usually see on the northern red oak. I don't have that picture here. And this is the sassafras, showing the ridges that are broken horizontally. We'll look at another tree that has that as well. So now that we've looked at buds and we've looked at bark, we should put buds and bark together, and make our lives just a little bit easier when we go outside. You shouldn't have to do just one or the other because that might not be fun. So here's an American beech. We have the light gray bark that's gonna have, that's gonna be very smooth. And then we have the fact that it retains its leaves through winter. They're straw colored. And I think it's great. You can do drive-by botany at 55, 65, 70 miles an hour and see these beige leaves flickering in the wind on the lower branches. And I was doing some reading on the beech tree the other day, because I wanted to read a little bit more about it. And they often use the term mercescence with this. And if you were with me last year, we learned that mercescence applies to anything that is dead but still hanging from a tree. But we often hear the word associated with the American beech, so we'll stay with that for today. But I was reading about why they think the trees hold the leaves, and they had three different hypotheses. One was because when the leaf pushes out in spring, all these old dead leaves fall down on the ground. They could either be holding and making sure the ground stays moist, or they could be adding a new organic layer to the ground by decomposing and thereby adding like a nutrient boost to the beech tree so that it has just a little bit more energy being given to it. So those are the two. And then the third one is that they think this might be for herbivory to prevent deer from actually trying to munch on dead leaf to get to the new sprouts of the new shoots. So none of those have been tested, of course, but we at least have some working hypotheses that we should be thinking about. And then, of course, we have the alternating twigs and buds that we have here, which are really cool. Here are the hornbeams, and they have very annoyingly similar twigs. So this is a tree that I really don't recommend you try to identify if it is less than a couple inches in diameter at breast height, because if you don't have bark characteristics, you are going to have a very, you're going to become very frustrated, and I don't want that to happen. So the American hornbeam has this beautiful fluted sinewy bark, which is really pretty, which is why one of the common names for it is musselwood. And the Australia, or the hop hornbeam, has this very shaggy, shreddy bark. So that makes it very easy to take a look at that and see which is which. I often find hornbeams near the water, and I find hop hornbeams in a little bit higher in drier spots, but I have seen both of them growing right next to each other as well. So take everything about location and habit with a grain of salt. And here is a sweet or black birch, and you can see we have the bark here with the nice linosol lines on it. This will also break into plates and become platy barked. From what I was reading in the tree bark book. Here is our twig, and we have a spur shoot. So this is several years worth of growth, and then here's the bud right on the end, which is usually a really pretty green and brown, different colored scales on that. It doesn't have a true terminal bud, as you see from here. And looking down on it, you can see a slight zigzag here from the not having a terminal bud, and then you can see all these spur shoots coming off of it. And if you're still not sure if you've got the right tree, this is a great scratch and sniff. So if you do that, you should be able to find out or come up with a nice wintergreen smell. Here's the river birch. Just like the black birch, which I didn't mention, it has preformed catkins on it. And here are the different buds on it. And here's a bud with the catkins going past it. That's usually how I identify it if I can't see this awesome bark, which has got that, I think it's a salmony color to it as it's peeling back, and you see some lenticel lines in it. Always very pretty. And then I thought we should go back to the maples. So we looked at our maple twig earlier, and here is our smooth bark maple, and here it's starting to get those cracks in it, those vertical cracking, because that cork cambium is starting to break. And then here is our silver maple, where we have lots more buds, and our bark has those long vertical strips on it that are starting to flake off and start to look like it's shagging a little bit. So a note to everybody, I often do not try to teach anybody red maple bark. It's not easy. It's annoying because it's so variable. So go for if you can see some red twigs with few buds, that'll help you right away. And you're looking for opposite branching, remember, and that'll help you. The other thing that you could have that has the smooth bark is obviously a beech, and a beech is going to have those long buds that are pointy and alternate. So those are your maples. Here are some more maples. Here's our Norway maple. It has the milky sap when the leaf is pulled off at the petiole at the base of the stem. It has these leaf scars that are touching on the sides of on the opposite sides of where the buds are, like we saw in the box elder. And then over here we have the silver maple. These are usually a chocolate brown bud that is very long and pointy. And that's how I identify sugars all the time. If it's at all rounded, I don't come near sugar because it has to be pointed if it's going to be a sugar maple. And over here we have the sycamore. Sycamore has a lot of things going on. We have that platy bark that we talked about earlier. We have this zigzag stem that's going on. And here you can see the leaf scar. And then this is a stipule scar right here. This little line that goes around that way. And this is the stipule. It looks like a little hula hoop skirt, which I think is really funny. And then of course it has the fruit that hangs in singles throughout the winter months. And here's black cherry. Again, this is another one that's going to look very light and delicate and small, especially against the sky, because it has a simple leaf, but it's going to be hard to distinguish from your hop hornbeam and your hornbeam, especially when it's young and it has the lenticel lines on the bark. The thing that's going to help you is if you scratch and sniff this, it's going to have a little bit of a burnt almond smell. And some people find that pungent and not attractive at all. And then here is the scaly pattern on the bark that's happening. You can see some little lenticel lines on it. And then here is the black knot fungus that is often found in this species. Very attractive tree, but often has a lot of breaking twigs and branches off of it because of this fungus that's in it. Here is the ash. Ash bark can look very variable, which is why I put in the two different pictures. I often find this white lichen growing on it that almost seems to sort of indent into the tree. Otherwise, it has these long diamond-shaped patterns on it. White ash is going to have these smiling American leaf scars with a bud sitting right in it. And I tried to show a couple more on the terminal bud. Whereas our green ash, our stern Pennsylvanians, it's usually straight across and the bud sits on top of it. And I often find smirking Pennsylvanians because there's usually some sort of a little notch, but it's nowhere near as dramatic as this one here. So most of the time I see green ash. I don't see as many white ash. And anytime you're in a floodplain, you should be thinking green. If you're up high and dry, that's when I think white. White ash like to be up high in well-drained soils. They're not interested in having standing water or a lot of water in their root system. And here's tulip tree. This one I think has these interlocking ridges that look like either the tips of arrows or the fetching feathers around the bottom. And then we have that has the white inside the furrows of the bark, has the whites, the sconces against the skyline if you're looking up in the tree. And then it has this really cool valvate bud, and you can see the seam right here. Sometimes they look like little mitts. I think they look like platypus tails because I think that's a kind of funny thing to think of when you're looking at trees. And here's the elm. Again, this is the one that has the rhododendron on the side. And elms are usually squishy when they're younger. So when I go up to an elm tree and I can squash it in, I know that it is an elm. And I usually think of these as peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. So this is the peanut butter and jelly in the middle. We've got bread on this side and bread on the outside. And that's how it's a whole bunch of sandwiches smushed on the tree, and that's why it's squishy. Against the sky, it often, some people call this thing, it looks like fish scales or fish bones. I'm not sure. I've done a lot of fishing in my life, and I'm not sure they look like that, but I'm not a professional fisherman or woman, so I can't say. And then the buds are usually very obvious on either side of the twig in an alternating pattern. I didn't this, so I think that this is American elm in the middle, but I think some of this stuff is not slippery, and I think or this one might be slippery, and I think this one might be a non-native elm. So I didn't think I should actually go to species here because I didn't have enough information to make a correct call. And everybody loves hackberry. These huge long ridges of leftover wrinkles on the outside of the tree, very cool. And they have these really slender, small buds on their twigs, and they sometimes are curving back towards the tree. Pretty cool tree. Don't always see it in a large species size, but there are lots to be found in the Charlottesville area. I'm always surprised when I run into them because they're a cool tree. And a lot of people, when they aren't making these long ridges, they just look like little warts because they don't have the age to have all this cool pattern on them. And I decided I should throw some walnuts in. Here is the black walnut, and it's really dark bark. And my bitter nut walnuts or my white walnuts, I wish this bark hadn't come out looking so dark. These ridges on top are really light white, and it's a very white bark in comparison with the black walnut. I would say it's sort of an in-between of like I would say it's more like a northern red oak with the white topped ridges, but there's also some white in between in the furrows too. But the cool part is if you look at the bud, it has these little fuzzy hairs between the bud scar down here and the leaf scar down here and the bud for next year. So here's a little fuzzy maybe it's an eyebrow, I don't know. Whereas over here on our black walnut, we do not have any fuzz on the outside on the top of our buds. It's only on our butternut. Hickories, here's a shagbark. They started the presentation with a shagbark. They have hairs all over the twig, and they have a really big bud on them, and then they've got the shags on the tree. So you can't really get wrong on that one. And then here are some other hickories. Pignut does not have any hairs. Mockernut does. No shags. This bark could be either of these two trees. I like the interlocking diamond shape pattern that I see on this bark. Over here, very messy bark, but there's still some diamond shapes in there. And this is bitternut hickory bark. And here's our bitternut with that sulfur yellow bud. It's a naked bud, as we talked about earlier. Just knocks your socks off. You can't miss that when you're outside. I think some people have heard me say this, but I think it looks like a dinosaur toe, prehistoric and gross. So that's what I think. And then here are, I often get asked in the field about the difference between spines, thorns, and prickles. Here are some spines. Spines are modified leaf parts, and these are what would have been the stipules of the leaf for the black locust. And here's some black locust bark. I think of black locust bark being thick and ropey in the ridges, and they're not regular when I look at black locust bark. And then, of course, thorns are modified branches, and I couldn't help but find a honey locust, and that thorn is just amazing. And here you can see where the bud would be. It almost looks like it's swollen, even though it's embedded in there. And awkwardly, we just looked at the black locust, and this is the honey locust. They're both in the pea family, but I don't think it's a pea thing to have embedded buds, but it just happened to be the case in this. And look at this. This thorn is getting branches on it. So that's why these are thorns, because they are modified branches, not modified leaf parts. And then for prickles, those are on the epidermis, the skin of, or the outside layer of any plant. So the rose is covered in prickles, not thorns, for any of those that are. I hope I didn't disappoint anybody with that new update on what they are. And this is the red oak group. I had to throw some oaks in there before the end of the presentation, especially because we have the black oak as I think the on the advertisement for this one. So red oak group, I thought I'd do 2 red oak group, and I'll do 2 white oak group. The red oaks definitely always have a darker bark. This is the northern red, and it has those beautiful white ski slopes that come all the way down the tree. But in between those ski slopes, it's really dark. And our black oak bark is very dark as well. I look for the darkest bark in the woods, and I usually think that's going to be my black oak. And when I find my twig, I find the velutea. This is the velvet gray hairs that are covering all the bud scales on these. And when you look down on these buds, they should be angular, looking like the pentagon or pyramidal in shape. And then my northern red oak has these beautiful overlapping shingle buds that are sort of a chestnut red color. Very pretty. And then our white oak group, we have our white oak here. Here's our bark, and I think of the white oak as peeling left and right with shingling around the tree. I think that's what I see here. And the white oak buds are usually small and rounded. Often people tell me they look like buttons, but I don't know many rounded buttons, so I'm not sure where that comes from. But one of the characteristics of oaks that I haven't mentioned is that oaks always have a cluster of buds together at the end of the branch, and that's how you identify that you've at least got an oak. If you have a cluster of buds and they are opposite, you just got to start thinking maple. But if you have a cluster of buds and they're just a mess, it's always an oak. And if the bark is lighter gray in color and not dark, it's usually a white in the white oak group. And then, yeah, I think the cluster of buds and then the color of the bark can tell you if you're heading to white or the green group or the red group. And then you'll have to do a little bit more work from there. This is a chestnut oak here, and this is going to be those long ridges, but they have the horizontal breaks in them that we talked about earlier. And then here's some chestnut oak buds all clustered on the end of a branch. All right, here are my references for my talk tonight. And now I guess I have to see if you guys have any questions for me. And thank you everybody for going through this with me. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so that I can see everybody and answer questions. So someone wrote in here, I answered what does DBH stand for. Someone asked ash with emerald ash borer damage will have blonde bark. Yes, from the woodpecker's work. Yes, they usually scrape off the outer bark, which isn't always very attractive, but it's a new way for us to identify those trees now. But we have to be a little careful because those trees are becoming weaker and we have to be careful about them falling, especially in heavy winds or long rainstorms. Montpelier has some great giant hackberry trees. There's some really good ones over at Piedmont, Virginia Community College. And I wouldn't have thought that, but I was over there looking at some trees. There's some good giant hackberry trees along the Rivanna River in Key West. And they're also in the Riverside Park. There's some really good big ones in there too. Does anybody else have any questions?
I have sort of a question, but in terms of the beech tree and the naissance, I'd like your explanations better, but I had heard at one point that the leaves shaded out small saplings from underneath and was kind of putting a damper on competition.
That could very well be. I didn't read that as one of the things that they're suggesting might be going on, but any hypothesis until it's tested is valid, right?
Yeah.
But it's kind of neat because we actually have beech drops that come up underneath the saprophytic plant. So I'm not sure if it's giving them a little bit of shade so that they don't get scorched by the sun when they come up. There could be lots of different hypotheses. Okay. Well, I don't see a lot more questions coming through here. Someone Rose definitely does have prickles. I'm sorry. But it's how it goes. I guess they didn't do any botany before they wrote the was that a poem? I think it was a poem. Anyway, thanks everyone for coming tonight, and we'll see you again for I think the next one is going to be the how to plant a tree in March that I talked about at the very beginning today. Yes, March 12th, how to plant a tree.
Emily.
Thank you. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thank you.
You're welcome.